cane fields along the Mississippi shimmered under the merciless Louisiana sun of 1848, every stalk standing in rigid green rows, every row marching in a silent order that most men never noticed. But Gabriel did. While other enslaved workers saw only endless labor and burning heat, Gabriel saw intervals, distances, repetitions. Beneath the overseer's shouts and the rustle of sugarcane, he heard something else, an invisible rhythm, as if the land itself were humming a song built from numbers. Gabriel was 34 years old and belonged to the Duval plantation, a sprawling estate 2 hours upriver from New Orleans. He had been born in bondage, and the system that owned him believed it knew everything about him, his weight, his strength, his market value. What it didn't know, what it could never have guessed, was that inside his mind he was hearing patterns where others heard noise, building structures where others saw chaos, and, most dangerously, transforming numbers into something that sounded like music. He had never seen a music sheet or a mathematics book. Reading was forbidden to the enslaved, and Gabriel had learned early that curiosity could be as dangerous as defiance. But questions still grew in him, like wild vines. Why did some sounds calm his chest, while others made his teeth clench? Why did certain beats feel as if they could go on forever, without tiring the ear? Why did the creak of the cartwheels, the slap of bare feet in mud, the drip of water from the levee all seem to pulse in related ways? The first time he noticed it clearly, he had been 12, carrying buckets from the well behind the quarters. The buckets swung from a yoke across his shoulders, hitting his sides on every second step. Somewhere distant, a field hand was singing a work song in slow, even phrases. Between the thud of his buckets and the singer's drawn-out lines, something clicked. He realized he could predict exactly when the next note would come. Not by guessing, but by feeling a steady count in his head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, like an invisible ruler laid across time. From then on, Gabriel counted everything: the distance between fence posts, the strokes of a hoe before a man straightened his back, the time it took for a call shouted from one end of the field to reach the other, carried by human voices. His body labored, but his mind stayed elsewhere, building ladders of numbers, climbing them in secret. He learned without naming it that certain ratios of time and sound felt better than others. Twice as slow, 3 times as fast, dividing a beat into 3 instead of 2. It all lived in his head. His great turning point came one stormy night when he was 19. Rain hammered the tin roof of the quarters, the drops landing in uneven bursts. Somewhere outside, a loose rope clanged against a wooden post, steady and precise. Inside, a woman rocking a baby moved in a slow, soothing rhythm. 3 sounds, 3 movements, all different. And yet Gabriel suddenly heard how they could fit together. If the woman's rocking matched every second clang of the rope, and the roof's wild rain was ignored until it happened to land exactly on the same moments, then, for an instant, everything would align. He lay awake counting, waiting, feeling for that alignment. When it came, just once, for a heartbeat, his chest tightened in wonder. It felt like the world had struck a perfect chord that no one else knew had sounded. From then on, he wasn't just counting. He was listening for these unspoken chords hidden in ordinary noise. The plantation knew him as quiet, reliable, a man who rarely spoke unless spoken to. He never argued, never tried to run, never raised his hand against anyone. This made overseers consider him harmless, which was exactly what Gabriel wanted. Harmless men were ignored, and ignored men were free in at least one way. Their thoughts moved unseen. By 1848, Gabriel had worked his way into one of the most grueling but oddly advantageous positions on the plantation, hauling cane and water between the fields and the sugar house. The work kept him moving across the property, and for brief stretches by himself. Those solitary walks became his secret classroom. The squeal of cartwheels over ruts, the plod of mules, the distant clank of machinery in the sugar house, all of it fed his inner calculations. He began to imagine that every sound was a point on a line of time. Some points were close together, some far apart. But they could be measured. He started grouping them, 2 beats against 3, 3 against 4. The simple work songs he heard in the fields suddenly revealed hidden layers. He could tap his foot in one pattern, nod his head in another, and they would cross and rejoin like braided rivers. The realization left him almost dizzy. If he could write these crossings down, not with words, but with numbers, maybe he could hold the invisible structure still, the way a fence holds a wild hedge in place. But he had no paper, no slate, no chalk. All he had were scraps, bits of charcoal from old fires, pieces of broken brick, hard-packed earth, rough sugar house walls. He started small. Behind the sugar house, where sweet smoke layered the air and few bothered to walk, he drew lines with his fingertip in the dust. One line for time, little marks for beats. Above them he scratched numbers, 2, 3, 4, ratios, repeats. He wiped them away with his heel whenever footsteps came near. What Gabriel didn't know yet was that this habit, the secret marking of numbers to capture the music he heard in his head, would one day lead him to his most beautiful creation. It would also lead to its destruction, in a moment of cruelty so casual and absolute that no one on the plantation, not even the man who ordered it, would ever understand what had been lost. The Duval plantation sat near a bend in the river, on land that had been cleared and planted for generations. The main house was a 2-story structure of weathered white boards and wide verandas, shaded by live oaks heavy with Spanish moss. Inside, polished floors and imported furniture declared the wealth that sugar brought. Behind the elegance, out of sight of visiting merchants and neighbors, the sugar house labored day and night, boiling, grinding, steam rising in a constant haze. Gabriel's base of work was this sugar house. To most, it was just another site of fatigue and danger. Scalding vats, heavy gears, men losing fingers or hands to the rollers that crushed cane into juice. To Gabriel, it was also an orchestra. The creak of belts, the turn of wheels, the hollow thump of wooden paddles stirring syrup, the hiss of escaping steam. Each sound had its own tempo. The machines didn't move at random. Each gear demanded a consistent pace, or everything stalled or broke. One afternoon, as he waited with a wagon of cane for his turn near the rollers, Gabriel leaned against a post and closed his eyes. A long belt slapped its joint every 7 heartbeats, more or less. The big flywheel completed a turn every 4. A paddle struck liquid every 3. He listened, counting cycles, then quietly began tapping the side of the wagon with his fingers in a pattern that locked all 3 movements together. 7 against 4 against 3, meeting every 84 beats in the same place. It felt like building a bridge over a river he had never been allowed to cross. "Boy, you deaf or just lazy?" The shout snapped his eyes open. One of the white mechanics, a thick-armed man named Harlan, glared at him. "Your turn. Move that cane up. We ain't got time for you to stand there daydreaming." Gabriel answered with a quiet, "Yes, sir," and moved the wagon forward. He had learned long ago that any sign of inner life beyond obedience drew attention, and attention was dangerous. He pushed the cart to the jaws of the rollers, fed the stalks in, and watched them vanish into pulping teeth. But even as his muscles strained, his mind returned to the numbers, to the way the 3 rhythms met and parted like dancers. That night, when others in the quarters settled into exhausted sleep, he lay awake staring at the rough beams overhead. He knew now that simple counting wasn't enough. The patterns in his head were too many, too layered. If he wanted to keep them, to explore them, he needed a way to fix them outside his body. His memory was strong, but it bent under the weight of that many intersecting rhythms. He needed something steadier than a heartbeat, more lasting than breath. Over the next weeks he tested places, behind the sugar house where he had drawn in dust, along the back wall of the tool shed, shaded and rarely inspected. Finally he found his spot. A narrow space between 2 support posts under the sugar house's side lean-to, where discarded boards and old rope were kept. There, on a piece of flat, weathered plank half buried in dirt, he began to work. With a bit of charcoal stolen from under a cooking pot, Gabriel drew his first serious set of markings, a long horizontal line for time, short vertical lines dividing it into even spaces. Above them, stacked rows of smaller marks, each row its own rhythm, 1 row for 2s, 1 for 3s, 1 for 4s, 1 for 7s. When a beat in one row lined up exactly with a beat in another, he put a small circle. After a while, the circles formed patterns of their own, clusters and gaps, like stars in the sky. He didn't know the words ratio or least common multiple. He had never heard of European musicians who wrote down beats and pitches, nor of mathematicians who studied repeating cycles. All he knew was that when those circles fell in certain arrangements, the imagined sound in his head felt right. Not just pleasant, but balanced, whole, as if a question had been answered exactly. He started humming quietly as he drew, a barely audible thread of melody no one else would recognize as anything but aimless sound. But it wasn't aimless. Every note followed the timing on the board. When he dragged his finger along one row, his voice followed that beat. When he traced the circles where multiple rows aligned, his voice swelled, as if several invisible singers had joined him. If anyone had heard and understood what he was doing, they might have said he was composing. To Gabriel, he was just finally hearing what the numbers had always been trying to say. Days slipped into weeks, and the board grew crowded with lines and circles, with faint equations he invented to help himself remember how often two rhythms met. 3 and 4 met every 12 beats, 2 and 7 every 14, 3 and 5 every 15. He began to write small sets of numbers, a simple way to remember which combinations produced patterns that felt strong, which felt tense, which felt gentle. The danger of it gnawed at him. Every time he knelt by that plank, heart pounding, charcoal in hand, he was one footstep away from punishment. But the risk was bound to something larger than fear. If he did nothing, if he let the music in the numbers pass through him without ever taking shape, it felt like letting a river run dry in his chest. The board under the sugar house was no longer just wood. It was the only place in the world where what he heard could exist outside his mind. What Gabriel couldn't foresee was that the board would not remain his secret forever. Plantation life had its own currents, its own way of dragging hidden things up to the surface. And when his hidden work finally crossed into the sight of those who owned his body but not his mind, their response would be as swift as it was final. The man who unknowingly set everything in motion was not the master, but his older son, Etienne Duval. Etienne had returned from New Orleans that spring after spending 3 years apprenticed in a counting house. He was 21, accustomed to pens, ledgers, and polite society, but his father expected him to learn the land before taking on more responsibility. That meant walking the fields, visiting the sugar house, and appearing, at least outwardly, interested in the machinery that turned cane into money. On a humid afternoon in May, Etienne arrived at the sugar house with a kerchief pressed to his nose against the sour, sweet smell of fermenting juice. He wore a pale linen suit too fine for the setting, boots too clean for the muck. The overseer, a weathered man named Colton, hurried to his side, pointing out the main roller, the boiling pans, the cooling trays. Gabriel, hauling empty cane carts to the far side of the building, noticed the pair in the corner of his eye, but kept his head down. New attention was the worst kind. As Etienne and Colton moved around the building, the young man's gaze wandered. Numbers were familiar territory to him, but his numbers were rows in a ledger. Pounds shipped, gallons sold, debts owed. Here numbers took other forms: weights of cane, times of boiling, ratios of water to syrup. He was curious enough to ask occasional questions, and Colton, eager to impress, answered them clumsily. They reached the side lean-to. Colton gestured at the pile of lumber and old rope. "We keep some spare boards here. Tools sometimes. Ain't much to see, sir." Etienne's eyes drifted anyway. Something dark on one of the boards caught his attention. Lines, faint but deliberate, cutting across the weathered surface in neat rows. He stepped closer. "What is this?" he asked, brow furrowing. Colton squinted. "Looks like some markings. Boys sometimes scratch games, sir. Noughts and crosses, you know. I'll have 'em scrub it." But Etienne wasn't satisfied with that. He knelt, ignoring the dirt on his trousers. Up close, the markings were too organized to be idle doodles. Parallel lines, small vertical marks at regular intervals, circles where some of those lines met, and numbers, actual numbers, chalked faintly along one edge. 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 9. He traced one row with his finger, mentally counting the spaces. The circles did not repeat randomly. "This is counting," he murmured, "but not like tallying crates." Something about it tugged at memories from his brief schooling, a tutor mentioning harmonic ratios in passing, how certain relationships between lengths of vibrating strings produced pleasant sounds. Etienne had never cared deeply for music, but he remembered enough to feel a faint echo here. "Who's been working in this area?" he asked sharply. "Field hands, mostly," Colton answered. "Some of the sugar boys when we're patching walls. I'll find out which one did this." Gabriel, on the far side of the sugar house, felt it when the air shifted. He couldn't hear the exact words, but the tone, as sharp as a whip crack, needled the back of his neck. He glanced, saw Etienne bent over something under the lean-to, saw Colton turning to scan the yard. Instinct told him to keep moving, to look occupied, to become invisible. But his heart was suddenly pounding for another reason. They had found the board. Word spread through the enslaved workers faster than orders ever did. By nightfall, everyone in the quarters knew the young master done found some strange scratches by the sugar house, and that the overseer saying somebody been writing when they shouldn't. Writing. The word alone was enough to send a chill through the rooms. In Louisiana, as in most of the South, an enslaved person caught with writing, even harmless marks, could be whipped, sold, or worse. Dinah, a woman who worked in the big house laundry and had known Gabriel since they were children, caught his arm as the men settled after supper. "Tell me it ain't you," she whispered, eyes wide. Gabriel met her gaze for a moment, then looked away. That was answer enough. She sighed, a sound heavy with the knowledge of what white fear did when it brushed against black thought. "They ain't gonna understand what you're doing," she said. "Doesn't matter if it's music or counting or God himself humming in your head. All they see is you stepping where they say you can't." That night, Gabriel didn't sleep. Outside, frogs called from the ditches, their steady rhythms mocking his racing mind. He replayed his visits to the board, trying to count how many days the marks had been exposed, how deep the charcoal had sunk into the wood grain. Could he have hidden it better, wiped it more completely, chosen a place farther out where no one important ever went? By dawn, an answer formed in him, not to those questions but to a different one. If they had already seen enough to be suspicious, destroying the board now would not erase the danger. Scrubbed wood would only confirm that there had been something worth hiding. But there was another possibility, thin and desperate. He could claim ignorance, frame the marks as childish games or idle counting done without real understanding. Harmless, not threatening. The problem was the pattern itself argued against that. Anyone who had spent time with numbers, even just in ledgers, might feel what Etienne had already sensed. These marks were not random. They carried intention. They carried thought. The next morning, Gabriel was sent not to the fields, but to the sugar house. Colton waited for him by the door, jaw tight. "Master wants to see you," he said, "and you best watch every word you say." As Gabriel walked toward the main house, feet dragging in the packed dirt of the yard, he knew this path was different from all the others he had walked. Until now, his numbers had lived in the shadows of his mind and a scrap of wood under a lean-to. Today, for the first time, they would stand in front of the man who owned his life, and perhaps by the end of that meeting, they would cease to exist anywhere but in his memory. The main house smelled of tobacco, lemon oil, and the faint, stale perfume of guests long departed. Gabriel had been inside only twice before, both times to move heavy furniture. Each visit had impressed him with how much space could exist unused. Rooms set aside just for show, chairs no one sat in, objects too delicate to touch. Today, he was led past the front parlor into a smaller room lined with shelves, the office where Monsieur Duval conducted his business. Etienne stood near the window, arms crossed. Behind the desk, Duval himself sat, stocky and grey-haired, his features sunk into permanent lines of entitlement and calculation. On the desk between them lay the board. It looked smaller here, less like a secret instrument, and more like a piece of evidence. The lines and circles, so clear to Gabriel's eye, lay exposed under the pale morning light, charcoal strokes against weary grain. "Come closer," Duval said. Gabriel obeyed, stopping where the overseer Colton silently indicated. His heart thudded in his ears, but his face remained carefully blank. He had been practicing this mask all his life. "My son found this yesterday," Duval began, tapping the board with 2 fingers. He says one of you has been making calculations. He pronounced the last word slowly, as if tasting something sour. Do you know anything about it? Gabriel forced himself to look at the board as a man might look at an unfamiliar tool. Just long enough to be natural, not so long as to betray ownership. No, sir, he said. Looks like marks. Maybe boys playing. Etienne shifted slightly. Those aren't games, he said, impatience creeping into his voice. The intervals are regular. There are numbers along the side. Someone has been thinking about these systematically. Duval shot him a brief warning glance, then turned back to Gabriel. I didn't ask my son what he thinks, he said. I asked you what you know. Look again. This time, Gabriel let his eyes trace the lines more fully. He could see the pattern immediately. The row of twos, the row of threes, the meeting points circled where they aligned with fours and fives. This section, he realized with a twist in his gut, was the beginning of his favorite construction, one that, if completed, would have shown a rising set of shared pulses that felt like a ladder built out of sound. I just see counting, sir, he said finally. We sometimes scratch tallies, keep track of carts or bundles. Maybe someone did that. I don't know. Duval studied him. He had owned men and women all his life. He knew how lies looked on faces darkened by fear and sun. But he also knew that fear could make truth seem false and vice versa. He leaned back, fingers pressing together. Etienne, he said without breaking eye contact with Gabriel, tell him what you see. Etienne stepped closer to the desk, pointing to the rows. These aren't simple tallies, he said. Here, look, if you follow this row, every other mark is circled where it lines up with another. This set is in twos, that in threes, that in fours. The circles show when the beats match. It's like someone is measuring how often different rhythms align. Colton snorted softly. Rhythms. Plantation full of drums and singing. Now you want to make numbers out of it. But Duval's gaze sharpened. Who taught you to see that? He asked his son. Etienne hesitated. Some of this was in my studies. Ratios in music, harmonics. Honoring the right proportions makes sounds agreeable, the tutor said. It's similar here. If someone is doing this, he tapped the board, they're not just counting, they're experimenting. The room went quiet. The word experimenting floated there, heavy. Experimenting implies intention, curiosity, the kind of reaching mind that respectable society reserved for white men with money and books. To apply it to someone enslaved was to admit something the entire order tried daily to deny. Duval turned back to Gabriel. You work at the sugar house, he said. You hear the machinery, the belts, the wheels. You hear the drums at night, the singing, all that noise. Did you, at any point, decide to write it down? Gabriel knew then that the lie had already failed. Etienne's observation had broken the cover of childishness. No one would believe now that this was idle scribbling. The best he could hope for was to make it small, contained. I count in my head sometimes, sir, he said slowly. Helps the day pass. Maybe I scratched some of it once. Didn't think it was anything. Etienne's jaw tightened. He heard the evasion. Duval heard it too, but where his son heard offense to reason, Duval heard offense to order. You didn't think, Duval repeated softly. That much is clear. He tapped the board again. This is writing. I don't care whether it's words or numbers or little suns and moons. It is writing. And writing in the hands of slaves invites trouble. Songs are one thing. They fade. Marks like this stay. They let ideas linger where they don't belong. Gabriel felt the moment narrow, closing like a door. He thought of trying to explain, of saying that these weren't ideas about running or rebellion, but about something beyond all of them, something no whip could reach. But to Duval there was no difference. Anything that did not serve sugar and obedience was by definition a threat. Etienne, torn between curiosity and the boundaries he'd been raised with, spoke again, more cautiously. Father, it's possible he has a natural sense for patterns, if guided. Guided where? Duval cut in sharply. Into books? Into thinking he is more than what he is? You know the law. Teaching them letters is forbidden for a reason. He exhaled, a slow, practiced release. No. Curiosity in their place becomes arrogance. Arrogance becomes defiance. We've seen where that leads. In this state, in others. I will not have it in my yard. He picked up the board. For a strange, suspended instant, Gabriel thought he might hand it back to him. Tell him to use it only for measuring cane loads or timing shifts. Instead, Duval stood, walked to the small fireplace set into the office wall, and rested the board against the grate. You will not make these marks again, he said without turning. You will not scratch in dirt on wood on walls. You will sing when told, work when told, sleep when told. Whatever noise you hear in your head will die there. He reached for the iron poker, nudged embers to life, and began feeding kindling under the plank. Flames licked up, tentative at first, then bolder as dry wood caught. Black lines blurred, then warped, then vanished under blistered bark. Circle by circle, pattern by pattern, the record of harmonies no one else had ever heard curled into smoke. Gabriel watched without moving. No one told him to look away, and he knew better than to let his gaze wander now. In the wavering heat, he could almost convince himself that this destruction was only another pattern. Wood plus fire equals ash. But behind his eyes the board remained vivid, every ratio and intersection preserved in a place no poker could reach. Colton, Duval said as the last corner blackened, put him back with the field gangs. Less time around machines, too much noise down there already. No need to give it shape. Yes, sir. They dismissed Gabriel with a nod. He turned and walked out, legs trembling only once he reached the veranda. Outside, the sunlight struck him, harsh and indifferent. Somewhere behind the house, a worker's song rose over the fields, its melody simple and raw. Gabriel listened, and despite everything, his mind still measured the distance between each note, counted the beats between breaths. The board was gone. The marks were gone. But the music inside the numbers had not been burned. It had only been driven back into its original prison. One man's memory, beating in time with a heart the world had decided was worth less than the cane he cut. The return to the cane fields felt at first like being pushed backward in time. Gabriel's days shrank again to the rhythm of the hoe, the shout of overseers, the hiss of wind moving through tall stalks. The sugar house's clanking orchestra faded into distant background. Here, the sounds were simpler. Steel biting soil, creak of harness, the dull thud of stalks hitting the ground at harvest. But his mind had changed, and it didn't care that his body's work had reverted. The patterns he had drawn on the board did not vanish with its burning. They replayed behind his eyes with annoying clarity, lines of 2s, 3s, 4s, 7s, their intersections forming constellations of imagined sound. At night, when the fields were dark and the quarters thick with breath and snores, he lay awake and rebuilt the lost equations in his head. He realized after a few weeks that the destruction had done something he hadn't expected. Before, he had used the board to hold ideas still so he didn't have to. Now, with that crutch gone, his memory flexed harder. He began to attach rhythms not just to numbers but to images. The shape of a bent cane stalk, the arc of a man's swing, the distance between fence posts. Every ratio now came with a picture, a small hook for the mind to hang it on. One afternoon during harvest, he was paired with Samson, a broad-shouldered man known more for his strength than his patience. Samson swung with a heavy, steady cadence. 3 beats to each clump, cut, drag, toss. Gabriel, forced to match, found his own motions fitting into Samson's pattern. After an hour, he realized something. If he quietly added a half beat in his head between Samson's cuts, a silent step that never reached his feet, the imagined rhythm smoothed out the ache in his shoulders. His body still moved as required, but his mind rode on a different, gentler pulse. "Why are you always so quiet?" Samson asked suddenly, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. "Men talk while they work, makes the day go quicker. You just listen and stare at dirt like it's speaking back." Gabriel hesitated. It would be easy to shrug, to say nothing, but isolation had its own weight. "Dirt does speak," he said softly. "In rows, in spaces. I just listen different." Samson frowned, then let out a short laugh. "You one of those then, head full of clouds? Well, don't let the clouds get you whipped again. We heard about the board. They watching you, even out here." It wasn't a warning he needed, but hearing it from another man, spoken with rough concern instead of cold authority, landed differently. Gabriel nodded. "I know. I don't scratch no more." He didn't. Not on wood, not on walls. His hands stayed on tools and bundles. His fingers learned their own kind of discipline. But inside, he continued drawing, now with more ambition than before. Without the limits of a plank, he could stretch his imagined lines as far as he liked, stacking not 3 or 4 rhythms, but 6, 8, 10. He pictured them as ropes hanging from the sky, each swinging at its own pace. Where multiple ropes passed through the same point at once, a bell would sound. His task was to arrange the lengths so that those bells rang in ways that felt like answers to questions he couldn't name. Sometimes in the evenings, the men in the quarters sang call and response songs to shake off the day's weight. One voice would rise, thin and cracked or deep and booming, and others would answer. The leader might stretch a phrase unexpectedly, adding a beat or chopping one away. The chorus would adjust without thinking, following the change. Gabriel listened and silently traced their timing, cataloguing the ways they bent expectation without breaking the song. One night, an old man named Josiah led a slow, mournful tune. On every third line he held a note just a fraction longer, not enough for most to name, just enough to tug at the chest. Gabriel's internal ruler lit up. 3 lines, then a stretched beat. 3 lines, stretched beat again. It wasn't exact, but it was close enough to feel like a pattern. After the song, while the others settled, Gabriel sat beside Josiah at the doorway of the quarters. The older man's eyes were cloudy, his hands stiff from decades of work, but his voice still held strength strangers didn't expect. "You drag them notes on purpose?" Gabriel asked quietly. Josiah gave a tired smile. "Purpose? Ain't much we allowed to do on purpose round here." He scratched his jaw. "But some songs don't say what they need if you let every line be the same. You hold one, people feel it more. Maybe they don't know why, but they do." "Feels like your heart tripping, then catching," Gabriel said. "Exactly." Josiah glanced at him sidelong. "You hear it that way too?" Gabriel nodded. "I hear where it lands, how often. Almost like it could be written down with numbers." Josiah chuckled. "Numbers? You trying to measure sorrow now?" "Not measure," Gabriel replied. "Just see how it moves." Josiah studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. "Whatever helps your mind live in a place your body ain't," he said. "Just remember, some places in your head you can't take nobody else with you. Don't try too hard to drag them there. They might not forgive you for it." The warning was different from Duval's, but it cut in its own way. Gabriel understood. Even if he could somehow show others the full complexity of what he heard, the multiple pulses and their meeting points, most would likely find it strange, maybe even unsettling. What comforted him might feel like confusion to someone just trying to survive the day. In the months that followed, he worked mostly in silence. When songs rose, he joined enough to avoid notice, but he rarely led or drew attention. His greatest experiments took place in the invisibility between tasks, walking from one row to another, waiting for a cart to arrive, sharpening a dull blade. In those pockets he summoned entire structures of sound made from nothing but ratios and time. He developed favorites, designs that, if they had been written down and given instruments, might have been called compositions. A slow foundation pulse, with 3 faster patterns weaving through it, meeting every 48 beats in a heavy, satisfying crash. A restless piece where almost nothing aligned except at rare, shining intervals, like stars piercing a clouded sky. He gave them no names. That would have made them too real, too easy to mourn if lost. Yet some small part of him still wished they might one day leave the prison of his mind, not to impress masters or anger overseers, but to prove to himself that they were more than private illusions. To be heard even once by ears capable of recognizing what they were would mean they had existed fully. Without that, they remained half-born, perfect and untouchable, but also forever unshared. He didn't know that history would remember him that way, as the man whose equations for harmony lived and died almost entirely inside his skull, flickering through fields of cane like a song no one else knew had been written. The turning point came during grinding season, when the cane harvest reached its peak and the sugar house ran nearly day and night. The fields glowed with torchlight long after sunset, and the air was thick with smoke, and the metallic tang of hot machinery. Man and beast moved in exhausted loops, hauling, cutting, feeding the hungry mouth of the rollers. Gabriel had been reassigned temporarily from cutting to hauling loads between the far field and the sugar house. This work, brutal for the body, gave his mind a strange kind of relief. The path was familiar, the turns predictable. He walked it dozens of times each day, the ruts in the earth like grooves in a worn-out record. On one of those trips, with the wagon rumbling behind him and the sky black, but for a smear of stars, something new arrived in his mind. It came not as a single rhythm, but as two at once. No, three, layered so clearly, he almost stopped walking. One was slow, like the steady, ancient beat of hand drums in the quarters. Another was twice as fast, bright and insistent. A third floated above them, dividing time into strange, almost lopsided sections that somehow still completed the same circle. They locked together like perfectly shaped stones in a wall. He had built many such combinations before, but this one felt different. There was a completeness to it, a sense that nothing in it was wasted. Every meeting point between the rhythms sat exactly where his ear wanted it. Nothing dragged, nothing rushed. It was. In a way he lacked words for whole. As he walked, he tested it. He matched his steps to the slow pulse, swung his arms to the faster one, let his breath fall into the third. For a few staggering seconds, his entire body moved as if directed by a hidden conductor. The wagon creaked, the mule snorted. Underneath it all, the threefold pattern turned. By the time he reached the sugar house, he knew he had stumbled on something that, if lost, would haunt him. At the lean-to where his first board had died, he paused, hands tightening on the wagon handle. There was no new board now, no secret plank, but there were still walls, still dirt, still scraps. Against all reason, against all lessons drilled into his back and memory, a thought rose. Maybe once more. Just once. Fix this one in the world so it doesn't vanish when I do. Inside, the machine snarled and roared. Men shouted over the din. No one watched him specifically. He was just another hauler in a long line of haulers. He unhitched the wagon, stacked his cane where directed, then slipped around the side of the building under cover of steam and shadow. The spot had changed. The old plank was gone, replaced by newer boards, but a narrow panel of bare wall remained between two beams, stained with soot. Gabriel stooped, scooped a pinch of damp ash from near the foundation, and rubbed it between his fingers. It darkened his skin just enough to leave a mark. Heart kicking his ribs, he worked quickly. 3 horizontal lines spaced as evenly as his untrained hand allowed, short vertical marks for beats. Up the left side, he scratched the simplest version of the ratios that had come to him. 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 5. Numbers cramped and crooked, but legible to him. Where the imagined pulses met, in his mind's ear, not on any visible drum, he pressed a stronger dot of ash. The pattern unfolded under his fingertips. Even half-formed, it stirred the same shock of rightness he'd felt on the path. For a moment, the wall no longer felt solid. It felt like a door, one only he could pass through, into a place where time itself could be braided and unbraided at will. "Hey!" The shout hit him like a slap. He jerked his hand away, ash staining his palm. Harlan, the mechanic who had once barked at him for daydreaming, stood a few yards off, eyes narrowed. "What you doing back here?" Harlan stepped closer, squinting at the faint marks. "What's that?" Gabriel's body moved before thought. He wiped his forearm across the wall, smearing lines into an ugly bruise of grey. "Nothing, sir, just dirt. Wiping my hand." Harlan didn't buy it. He stepped right up to the wall, rubbing his own fingers along the smear, then studying them. "You making signs again?" he said. "They told us about that board. Thought they broke you of it." Fear rose, cold and sharp. "No, sir," Gabriel said quickly. "Ain't signs. Just leaned wrong." Harlan stared at him a moment longer, then jerked his head toward the main door. "Get back to your cart. I'll be telling Colton you were back here scratching. Let him decide what to do with you." The rest of the shift blurred. Gabriel hauled, loaded, unloaded, all on a sort of autopilot. Inside, the new pattern burned brighter for having been nearly exposed. Strange as it was, the danger confirmed its importance. No one went to this much trouble to stamp out what was worthless. That night, summoned to the overseer's shed instead of the quarters, he faced Colton's hard gaze and Duval's colder one. Harlan's report had been brief but damning. "Found him drawing on the wall," he'd said. "Same kind of thing they burned before, far as I could tell." Duval didn't ask questions this time. There was no board to examine, no son to offer half-sympathetic analysis. There was only a pattern he could not see, and the memory of defiance he had already punished once. "I told you," Duval said, voice low with contained anger, "that this would end. I gave you work away from the machines. I burned your foolishness. You chose to keep it alive." He nodded to Colton. "You know what to do." The whipping came quickly. 4 men holding Gabriel to a post behind the shed, while the lash cut blood from his back. He didn't count the strokes. Counting, for once, would have made things worse. Instead, he forced his mind back onto the threefold rhythm that had found him in the field. He ran it again and again, aligning the invisible beats with each explosion of pain. It didn't make the pain less. It only kept it from swallowing him whole. When it was over, when he lay on rough boards in the quarters, trembling and feverish, he found to his horror that some parts of the pattern were fading around the edges. The numbers along the side remained, but the exact feel of the meetings, the way one rhythm breathed against another, had blurred. Like a melody remembered only in fragments, it hovered just out of reach. He tried to rebuild it hour after hour as the night wore on, but each attempt felt thinner, less precise. Something had been lost in those few frantic seconds behind the sugar house wall, something that had only ever existed fully when drawn and heard together. Now the wall was smeared, and his body, wiser than his will, shrank from calling the memory back in full. In the days that followed, he realized a cruel truth. Some of his more complicated constructions depended on a kind of external anchor. Without even a faint sketch to ground them, his mind could not hold their entire shape indefinitely. He could recreate pieces, recall certain meeting points, but the exact totality would slowly drift. The equations for that particular harmony, the one that had seemed so complete, so final, were now damaged beyond repair. To anyone else, it might have sounded like nothing, less than a song hummed and forgotten. To Gabriel, it was like losing a room in a house where he had briefly felt safe. The punishment had done exactly what Duval had intended, without either of them understanding how. It had not only hurt his body and warned others, it had also proved that his most fragile, intricate works existed on a knife's edge. Without protection, without paper, without the right to hold a piece of charcoal without fear, they could be snatched from time so completely that only a dim echo remained. He did not try to draw again after that. Whatever music numbers still offered him would have to remain inside, carried from day to day like contraband the size of a soul. Years have a way of grinding even the sharpest edges off both cruelty and brilliance. By 1852, 4 harvests after the burning of the board, the Duval plantation looked much the same from the outside. Cane still rustled in the fields. The sugar house still breathed steam. The main house still held its polished silence. Men and women still bent their backs under the same sun. Gabriel, older now, shoulders more stooped, worked steadily among them. New boys came up from childhood into the gangs. Old men slipped into the slower tasks until sickness or age took them. Overseers changed, weather changed. Prices rose and fell with distant markets. Through it all, inside his skull, numbers continued their quiet revolutions. He no longer attempted to build his most elaborate structures. The cost of losing them a second time would have been too cruel. Instead, he focused on smaller patterns, simple ratios that fit comfortably inside a day's fatigue, the feeling of 2 beats playing against 3 without ever quite landing together until the 6th, the gentle sway of 3 against 4, resolving every 12. These he could hum under his breath while cutting, use to time sips of water, to predict when a cart would return. Sometimes, when the air was still and the overseer distracted, he dared to line his steps up with one rhythm, his shoulders with another, the swing of his arms with a third. To anyone watching, he was just a man walking. To him, for a few stolen seconds, he became an instrument only he could hear. One evening, as the sky bruised purple and the mosquitoes rose in clouds, a traveling preacher visited the quarters. Duval, ever concerned with appearing benevolent, occasionally allowed such visits to show that he cared for his people's souls. The preacher, a wiry man with blazing eyes, spoke with practiced fervor about bondage and deliverance, using the familiar stories of Egypt and Canaan. The enslaved listened with a mix of hope and hardened skepticism. They had heard promises before. At one point, the preacher clapped his hands in a triple pattern, clap, 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 then held a pause before repeating. "You hear that?" he cried. "3 for the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Even the beat testifies," the people murmured. Some clapped along. Gabriel, listening, couldn't help noticing that the preacher's supposed holy pattern did not, in fact, line up consistently with the tune the people hummed back. Little mismatches, unintentional syncopations, flickered through the crowd. It was messy, but there was truth in that mess, a reflection of lives that never quite aligned with the neat stories laid over them. After the service, as folks drifted back to their pallets, Gabriel sat outside a while longer, watching the moon rise above the cane. A thought came to him, sharp as a thorn. Nobody who spoke for God here had ever asked what the world sounded like in numbers. They spoke of heaven's choirs, of angels singing, but never of the ratios that would make their songs feel as perfect as they claimed. If there was a listener big enough to hear everything, surely that listener would notice when things fit just right. Thinking hard again. Dinah's voice came from the shadows. She settled beside him, knees cracking softly. The years had turned streaks of grey into rivers in her hair, but her gaze remained sharp. "Not hard," he said, "just measuring." "Still? After everything?" There was no accusation in her question, only weary amazement. "Can't stop hearing it," he admitted, "even when I want to. World don't move straight. It move in layers. Can't unsee that once you've seen it." She nodded slowly. "Maybe that's the Lord's way of talking to you, different from the preacher's way." "Maybe," he allowed, but in his bones it felt more like the world talking to itself and letting him overhear. As the 1850s wore on, news filtered through the plantation about events far beyond the river's bend. Talk of conflict between North and South grew louder. Enslaved people caught snatches of conversation about abolitionists, free states, compromise, secession. These words were like distant thunder, promising storm, but unclear where and when it would strike. Gabriel did not allow himself to hope too specifically. Hope, like complex rhythms, could be dangerous if not anchored in something firm. Still, his mind could not help making patterns, even from rumors. If pressure kept building, something would have to give. Even rigid systems had breaking points, moments when accumulated forces forced new structures into being. He would not live to see war or proclamations or amendments. His story bent toward a quieter end. In the summer of 1858, an outbreak of fever swept through the lowlands. Many fell sick in the quarters. Some recovered, many did not. Gabriel was among those seized by heat and chills, his sturdy frame suddenly fragile as dry cane. Laid out on a rough pallet, he drifted in and out of waking. The boundaries between sound and memory blurred. The coughs of the sick around him merged with the distant creak of a cart, the slap of a loose shutter, the chirp of insects. In that feverish haze, the old patterns rose. Not as separate constructions, but as one vast, overlapping web. Simple 2s and 3s, complicated 7s and 5s, all folding and unfolding in slow, luminous arcs. He saw, with a clarity he had never experienced in health, that even his most cherished designs were just fragments of a larger fabric. The river's flood cycles, the waxing and waning of the moon, the pace of seasons, the timing of storms, all of it lived in ratios, intersecting in ways no single mind could fully hold. He had brushed only a corner of that infinite cloth. Dinah, wiping his forehead with a damp cloth, saw his lips moving. "You want water?" she asked. He struggled to form words. "It's beautiful," he whispered, voice raw. "Nobody hears it, but it's there." She frowned, leaning closer. "What is, Gabe?" "The way it all fits," he managed. "Even when it's wrong for us, it's right somewhere." He wanted to explain, to hand her the vision blazing behind his eyes, but there was no language for it, Only numbers, only timing, only silent harmonies stretched across a life that had never been allowed to speak them openly. In his final clear moment, he realized something that hurt and comforted him at once. Every pattern he had loved, every equation that had turned into imagined sound would die with him. No paper held them. No student would inherit them. They would not appear in any book, not even as a footnote. In the world's official record, the music in his numbers would never have existed. Yet in another sense it had. For years, in fields and sugar houses and narrow cabins, one man had heard and shaped that music. It had changed the way he carried pain, the way he moved through days designed to crush him. It had given him a private grammar of beauty in a place built on ugliness. That mattered, even if no one else ever knew the specifics. When his breathing finally slowed and stopped, Dinah closed his eyes with rough, gentle fingers. To those who would remember him in the quarters, he had been the quiet man, who listened more than he talked, who moved with odd steadiness even under blows, who sometimes smiled at nothing. They would say he had something in his head, but they would never be able to say exactly what. The wall under the sugar house had long since been scrubbed and repainted. The board that once held his early equations was ash scattered to wind years before. No trace of his harmonies survived in wood, in soot, or in ink. Only in the brief, unrecorded moments when he aligned steps and breath and swing to unseen pulses, had his music fully existed in the world. History would not remember his name. It would not list him among composers or mathematicians. The equations that had created his unheard harmonies would remain unformed in any formal sense. But somewhere in the abstract, in different space where numbers live even when bodies do not, the patterns he found still fit together, just as they had under the Louisiana sun. Perfect, balanced, waiting for ears that would never come. Decades later, long after the Civil War had burned through Louisiana and left its scars on land and law alike, the Duval plantation stood half abandoned, its fields patchy, its sugar house quiet. New owners had come and gone, some trying to revive cane, others turning to different crops. The main house sagged, its paint peeling, verandas choked with vines. No one living there knew the names of those who had once labored in its fields. The ledger books that had reduced human lives to balances and tallies molded in a trunk in the attic, their ink fading. One autumn, a surveyor hired to assess the property brought along a young assistant, a man with a fondness for old buildings. While the surveyor measured boundary lines and checked levees, the assistant wandered. He stepped into the husk of the sugar house, now a hollow shell open to birds and wind. Rusted gears hung motionless. The floor was layered with dust and fallen leaves. Echoes of long-ago grinding and shouting seemed to cling faintly to the beams. Running his hand along a support post, the assistant noticed faint discoloration on one section of wall, a patch where soot had stained the wood unevenly. He leaned closer, squinting. For a moment he thought he saw something like lines, almost rubbed away, maybe just the grain playing tricks. When he blinked, they were gone again, swallowed by time and grime. Shaking his head, he stepped back out into the sunlight, leaving whatever ghosts or patterns remained to their own quiet company. He would never know that, on that very spot, a man who died nameless in any record had once tried briefly to anchor a perfect harmony in the world. Scholars in later generations would study the music that had formerly emerged from the Black South. Spirituals, blues, jazz, each carrying complex rhythms and layered pulses that would astonish European-trained ears. They would marvel at polyrhythms that set 3 against 2, 5 against 4, at harmonies that bent and slid in ways traditional Western notation struggled to capture. Some would speculate about the roots of this sophistication, tracing threads back through work songs and drum patterns, through the brutal crucible of plantation life. They would not, because they could not, include Gabriel in those histories. His specific contributions had vanished with his breath. No cylinder recordings, no notebooks, no transcriptions remained. The equations he had formed in his mind, the internal architectures of time he had built and rebuilt while hauling cane and enduring whips, remained undocumented. At best, his existence would be hinted at in a passing remark from an overseer's letter or a vague mention in a WPA interview a century later. There was a quiet man back then, always counting, always tapping his fingers. Yet the absence of his name did not mean the absence of his influence in a broader, invisible sense. Ideas, once thought, have a way of seeping into the world even if their exact form is lost. Gabriel's hidden habit of hearing multiple pulses at once, of finding peace in fitting them together, may have softened his responses to the songs around him, nudged a phrase here, a pause there. The men and women who worked beside him might have unconsciously mirrored his small rhythmic choices, carrying them forward into their own singing, their children's lullabies, the clapping games of the next generation. From there, in ways no historian could chart, those tiny shifts could have joined the great river of black musical tradition that flowed out of the South, into sanctified churches where choirs clapped on unexpected beats, into juke joints where pianists pounded left-hand patterns against unorthodox right-hand lines, into brass bands that bent marches into something swaggering and new. Somewhere, embedded deep in that collective creativity, might lie faint echoes of a man who once lined up his footsteps with invisible cycles in a cane field. Modern mathematicians studying rhythm would eventually develop notations and equations to describe complex polyrhythms with precision. They would write about least common multiples of cycles, about phase patterns, about visualizing beats as points on circles instead of marks on lines. Some of their diagrams would look uncannily like what Gabriel had scratched on a rough plank beneath the sugar house in 1848. Rows of pulses, circles at meeting points, ratios along the side. But the path from his ash-darkened fingers to their published papers would remain unmarked. They would believe accurately, in one sense, that they were formalizing ideas discovered through experimentation and analysis. They would not know that a century earlier, a man with no access to paper had walked similar roads in his head, driven purely by the need to make sense of sounds that would not leave him alone. In the end, Gabriel's story sits between presence and absence. The man was real, his bondage real, his bruises and calluses and hunger real. His inner work, building harmonies from numbers, hearing music where others heard only noise, was just as real to him, but it left almost no trace in the physical world. When his master burned his board and erased his wall, they did more than punish a disobedient slave. They deleted the only written record of a singular way of thinking about time and sound. What they could not erase, because no one can, was the simple fact that such thinking had happened. For a span of years on a Louisiana plantation, under one of the most oppressive systems humans have devised, a man with no formal education discovered, for himself, that numbers could sing. He heard relationships between pulses, built internal scores out of ratios and meetings, and used them to survive days designed to crush him. No one heard his full harmonies while he lived. No one ever would. They rose, played out in the silent concert hall of his mind, and faded. But the universe they described, of cycles intersecting, of rhythms fitting and misfitting, of beauty woven into the fabric of time, remained. Others would discover and name pieces of that universe later, in lecture halls and conservatories. Gabriel's role in that great unfolding would go uncredited, but not undone. Because whether written or not, whether heard or not, the equations that created his harmonies were true. They governed pendulums and tides, drumlines and heartbeats, engines and orbits. For a while, in a place that denied his humanity, one man glimpsed those laws from beneath a burden of cane. He saw music in numbers, and though his master burned his notes, he could not unmake what had been seen. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.